This is a function. This is an inverse function. The function undoes what the inverse function does, and the inverse function undoes what the function does. They undo each other. They do opposites of each other. So let's take a really simple one right now and look at it. F of x equals x minus 5. What would the inverse function be? What would be the opposite of x minus 5? It would be x plus 5. Okay, now there is an algebraic way to figure this out, and all you have to do is, some people like to do it this way. They take out the f of x and they write down y equals x minus 5. And then what you do to find the inverse function is you solve for x. You try to get the x alone instead. Okay, so you're changing the roles here. So to get the x alone, we add 5 to both sides, and then you have y plus 5 equals x. Isn't this our inverse function right here? Yes, it is. Except that's an x and that's a y. So what you would do after you get the x alone, after you solve for the x, then you want to switch the x and the y. X plus 5 equals y. And now this y is your inverse function. So we're going to say this equals f of negative 1, or f to the negative 1 power equals x plus 5. This means the inverse function, the inverse of f. And you can see that this is the same as this. Now what some people do, I solved for x. I got the x alone. If you wanted to, right here, you can switch the x and the y right here and then solve for y again. Actually, that's how I learned it. You take the x and the y and you switch them. So you see how I just took this right here and I switched the x and the y? Does that make sense? And then you solve for y. And it's the same exact thing. It's just a different way of seeing it, and I kind of want to give you guys both of them. Okay? And so this is now your inverse function. And you guys can see it right there. So let me give you guys another example here. Let's take one it's not as simple as a linear equation. Let's look at a quadratic. Let's multiply it by 2 and then add 5 to it. No, let's not do that. Let's just add 5. I want to keep it simple for explanation purposes. Now, what would this be as an inverse function? Okay, let's try it. What we're going to do is we're going to take this and put the y right there. And I'm going to solve for x this time. I'm going to get the x alone instead of the y. So I subtract 5 from both sides. I get y minus 5. That equals x squared. How do I get that x alone? Square root it. Okay, now some of you guys might recognize the problem right now. If you don't recognize the problem, don't worry. I'm going to explain it in a second. This would be your inverse function. F of negative 1 equals plus or minus x minus 5. And what I did is I just took out the y and I put the x in there. I switched the x and the y's. Okay, there's always a switching of the x and the y's when you're finding the inverse function. Now, a really neat thing about inverse functions is that they reflect. They reflect across the y equals x line. The y equals x line is right there. This is y equals x. And it's like that because if you plug in a 1, then you're going to get a 1. Okay, if you plug in a 2, then you're going to get a 2. Okay, that's why you get a diagonal line like that. Now, this function right here is x squared but moved up 5. And so let's go ahead and graph that. It's x squared but moved up 5. We're going to say that is moved up 5 spaces right there. I'm not following my tick marks on here. So this is 0, 5. It's moved up 5 spaces. Now, if this were to reflect across this line right here, it would look like this. 5, 0. Oh. Like that. So it reflects over it. Now, I have a question for you guys. Is this a function? Is my f, is this a function right here?
Yes.
Yeah, it passes the vertical line test. Each domain number is mapped to exactly one range number. But what about this guy?
No.
No, he is not a function. So, can you find the inverse of this function? No, there is no inverse for this function. Why? Because it doesn't pass the vertical line test. So technically, this guy does not exist because, well, he's not a function. Look, he doesn't pass the vertical line test. I mean, you know, it's kind of neat. You could tell right here by looking at that if there's an inverse function. There's such a thing called a vertical line test. What other kind of test might there be to see if there's an inverse function?
Inverse function test.
No, it's not an inverse function test, a horizontal line test. If it doesn't pass the horizontal line test, then you know that there's no inverse function. Because when you flip it like this, you know, when you reflect it, it is not a function. All right, now this is I'm just going to repeat what I just said to you guys so it's in the video. This is a higher level concept that we will get to eventually, but it's not crucial right now for this chapter. The most important thing for this chapter is understanding this right here. Do you know how to switch the x and the y and then get your inverse function using inverse operations? That's it.